The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, their light spreading across polished marble floors and golden table settings. Waiters moved swiftly between tables draped in silk, guests dressed in their finest. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, the merging of two families through the marriage of a young couple. The bride stood quietly at the center, her gown simple but elegant, her smile reserved as whispers filled the room around her. Not whispers of admiration, whispers of scorn. They couldn't have picked anyone more plain? One woman muttered, her pearls gleaming against her dress. Another leaned in, lowering her voice but not enough to hide it. Does she even know how to carry herself among people like us? The bride's eyes flicked toward the sound, but she didn't answer. A group of relatives, all belonging to the groom's side, stood together like a wall of judgment. Every look they cast her way came sharpened with superiority. The groom himself laughed nervously, pretending not to hear. But he didn't say a word in her defense. She's from a nobody's family, one of his cousins mocked openly. He could have married into any elite circle. Instead, he settled. The comments struck her like stones, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she pressed her hands together, her fingers curling around the fabric of her gown beneath the table. They weren't mocking her personality. They weren't mocking her dress. They were mocking her worth, assuming they already knew the full measure of it. The groom's mother approached, her tone syrupy but cold underneath. She leaned in close enough for only the bride to hear. This is all very charming for you now, but don't forget, you'll always be remembered as the one lucky enough to marry. Into this family, without us you wouldn't even be in this room. The bride's chest tightened, but her lips formed the faintest smile. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. Around her, the room continued shimmering with wealth and arrogance, but none of these people had the faintest idea of what lay behind her silence. They believed she was helpless. They believed her presence was a favor. They believed her entire identity now rested in her belonging to their name. And as the night wore on, as the sting of each insult grew heavier, she remembered something with perfect clarity. Power is loudest when it whispers. The day would come, and sooner than they thought, when she would deliver the silence that would rattle them far, louder than their arrogance ever rattled her. The following morning came with sunlight pushing through long curtains, but her mind was still replaying the ballroom whispers from the night before. Each voice, each pointed glance, each cruel laugh clung to her like smoke. They thought they had stripped her pride from her. They thought they had left her humiliated, small, insignificant in front of the glittering crowd. But what they didn't know was that their arrogance blinded them. They had judged her by the dress she wore, the family they assumed she came from, by how softly she answered and how calmly she carried herself. What they couldn't see, what she refused to show, was the weight of the empire she already held in her hands. For years she had avoided broadcasting her accomplishments. While the groom's family flaunted wealth with shining cars and glossy estates, hers was the quiet kind built on intelligence, vision, and power that didn't need to shout. She was the only daughter of a man who had started with nothing and built an international corporation recognized across industries. And now, after his passing, she didn't just inherit his name. She inherited the authority to decide the future of some of the largest contracts on the market. On paper, she wasn't just a bride. She was a chairwoman, a silent powerhouse with signatures that shifted markets, approvals that determined the fate of billion-dollar projects. For the moment, she had chosen humility. She wanted love to be for herself, not her last name, not her empire. That was why she never said a word when the groom's family sneered. But behind their company's polished portfolios, their empire's shining walls, sat proposals worth staggering sums, waiting, unknowingly, for her decision. And among them was their crown jewel, a sprawling development project valued at $840 million, a project their fortune clung to, a project submitted for approval to her office under her authority. While they whispered behind chandeliers about how she was lucky to marry into wealth, the cruel irony was this. In just a breath, she could wipe away more than they had ever flaunted. She looked at her reflection in the mirror that morning, her jaw set, her eyes no longer meek but steady, steel hidden behind calm. They would never suspect until it was too late. Yesterday, she had been their silent target, mocked for her simplicity. Tomorrow, she would become the storm they did not see coming. 2 days later, the Groom's family gathered in their glass-walled boardroom, high above the city skyline. They were in their element here. Glossy binders stacked on the table, projection screens glowing with charts, analysts buzzing nervously around, and contracts waiting to be sealed. Their most important project, yet the $840 million development, was on the verge of approval. "Once this is signed," the Groom's father said with smug certainty, "it will put us decades ahead of our competitors. Nothing can touch us after this." Laughter broke out around the table, the same smug tone that had filled the ballroom on the night of the wedding dinner. One of the uncles sneered, "Imagine her face when she realizes she married into this. That simple little bride had better remember she's lucky." But while they gloated, an assistant hurried into the room with a pale expression. He whispered into the father's ear, sliding an envelope across the polished table. The atmosphere shifted. The father frowned, opening the letter. His eyes scanned quickly, then his face drained of color. "What is this?" he barked, his voice sharp with disbelief. The room fell silent. "It's a notification," the assistant stammered. "Your project, it's been declined, effective immediately." Gasps circled the table, chairs scraped, jaws tightened. The family leaned in, disbelief rippling through them. The father slammed the papers down, shouting, "Declined!" "By who?" The assistant swallowed hard. "The final authority rests with the holding company's chairwoman." The decision was hers. The Groom's mother snatched the paper, reading the signature at the bottom. Her eyes went wide. She whispered the name aloud, the bride's name. Every head whipped around, stunned into silence. They all knew it. The young woman they had mocked. The one they sneered at, dismissed, humiliated. The bride who sat quietly. While they ridiculed her, was not just someone's daughter. She was the decision-maker controlling the very empire their fortunes depended on. Disbelief collapsed into a suffocating silence. And then panic. If she could reject this, she could reject anything. Their walls of arrogance began to crack. The father stood up, his hands trembling with rage and fear. "No, this is a mistake. She wouldn't. She can't." But deep down, they knew the truth. She could. She had. In one quiet stroke of a pen, the woman they belittled had shut down their prize. Their family's foundation trembled under her single, decisive, silent move. And somewhere far from their boardroom, she sat calmly, a soft smile tugging at her lips. For years they believed she was beneath them. Now, they finally knew who was standing far, far above. The next morning, the family arrived uninvited at her office. Not the ballroom, not the country club, not the high-rise they owned, her office. For the first time, the polished parents and arrogant relatives had to walk through, glass doors where her name gleamed brightly in. Polished silver letters, chairwoman. They expected desperation from her. They expected to intimidate, to demand, to command her like they had in that ballroom. But as they stepped inside, they realized the power dynamic had flipped. Employees greeted her with respect, standing straighter when she entered the room. The bride they had called lucky to be here was suddenly revealed as the very reason half of them were even in business. The groom's father cleared his throat, his voice trembling. "There must be some mistake. The contract paperwork." She raised her hand politely, and he fell silent. For a woman they had once dismissed as invisible, her presence commanded more silence than a gavel in a courtroom. "There was no mistake," she said calmly. "I reviewed the project. I signed my decision. It is final." The mother's voice cracked, desperation leaking through her polished tone. "Do you understand what this means? That project was everything. Without it—" Her eyes met hers with a quiet steel. "Then think of this as a reminder. You told me I would have nothing without your family. You made sure everyone in that room believed it. But today we both know it isn't true." The groom, pale and silent at her side, finally tried to speak. "You should have told me." "Why didn't you say anything?" Her smile was soft, almost sad. "Because I wanted you and your family to see me as I am. Not for my name, not for my wealth, not for what I control. And what I saw in return told me everything I needed to know." Silence swallowed the room. Their empire, their pride, their certainty, all cracked open by the woman they laughed at only days before. She gathered her papers, stood tall, and walked past them without another glance. The boardroom of men and women who prided themselves on power could not even move. They remained seated in quiet humiliation, watching the bride they once dismissed demonstrate a kind of strength none of them could match. When she stepped into the sun outside, her gown was no longer a symbol of humiliation. It became her armor. She hadn't lost anything that night at the wedding. They had. Because true worth never needs defending. It only needs the right moment to be revealed. And hers had just dismantled an $840 million empire.